Rain tapped softly against the windows of the Willowbrook tea room, turning the world beyond the glass into a watercolor of gray skies and blurred cobblestones. Inside, golden lamplight shimmered across polished wood tables, delicate porcelain cups, and the gentle curls of steam rising from freshly poured tea. The room carried the comforting scent of cinnamon cakes and warm honey, yet one figure seemed entirely separate from the cheerful atmosphere around her. Miss Seraphina Vale sat alone near the window, her hands folded neatly around a china cup. She wore a simple cream dress trimmed with faded lace, elegant despite its age. A navy cloak rested over the back of her chair, damp from the rain outside. Though she possessed a beauty that might have turned heads in the grandest ballroom in London, she appeared unaware of it. Her attention remained fixed upon the book resting beside her plate. Several guests glanced toward her throughout the afternoon. Some admired the graceful curve of her profile. Others whispered quietly about the mysterious young woman with eyes the color of summer violets. Yet Seraphina neither encouraged attention nor sought it. She offered polite smiles when necessary and spent most of her time in peaceful silence. She was accompanying an elderly widow who had retired upstairs to rest after their journey. The unexpected hour alone was a rare luxury. Seraphina intended to enjoy her tea, finish a chapter of her novel, and return quietly to her duties. Instead, fate chose a different plan. A sudden movement near the doorway drew her attention. 3 children stood just inside the tea room. Their clothes were unmistakably expensive. The eldest boy wore a tailored dark coat that fit his tall frame with noble precision. Beside him stood a little girl in a pale blue dress, clutching a ribbon between nervous fingers. A much smaller boy peered from behind them both, his wide eyes studying the room with anxious curiosity. They were clearly searching for someone. Seraphina expected them to approach a parent or governess. Instead, they walked directly toward her table. The eldest stopped before her chair and cleared his throat with obvious determination. "Miss," he said. Seraphina lowered her cup. "Yes." For a brief moment the boy appeared to lose his courage. The little girl nudged his arm. The smallest child whispered, "Ask her." The boy inhaled deeply. Then he spoke words so unexpected that Seraphina wondered if she had misheard them. "Would you pretend to be our future mother?" The teacup nearly slipped from her hands. For several seconds she simply stared. The children stared back. Finally she blinked. "I beg your pardon?" The little girl leaned forward urgently. "We are serious." The youngest nodded. "Very serious." Seraphina looked from one solemn face to another. "I believe there must be some mistake." "There isn't," the boy replied. His voice carried a maturity unusual for someone so young. "My name is Cedric Everly. This is my sister Lillian. Our brother is Arthur." Recognition flashed through the room like lightning. Even Seraphina knew the name Everly. The children belonged to Duke Tristan Everly, one of the most respected noblemen in the kingdom. Suddenly the situation felt even more impossible. "You are the Duke's children?" "Yes," Cedric answered. Seraphina set down her cup carefully. "And why exactly would the Duke's children ask a stranger to pretend to be their mother?" The confidence vanished from Lillian's face. Her eyes lowered toward the ribbon in her hands. "Because father is going to marry Lady Beatrice." The name seemed to darken the air around them. Arthur climbed onto an empty chair. "She doesn't like us." Seraphina frowned gently. "Surely that isn't true." "It is," Cedric said firmly. "We heard her speaking with her friend last week." His jaw tightened. "She said children are inconvenient." Lillian swallowed hard. "She said once she becomes Duchess she'll send us away." "Away where?" Seraphina asked. "Boarding schools," Cedric replied. "Different ones." The little girl's eyes filled with tears. "We've already lost our mother." The simple sentence struck Seraphina harder than any dramatic speech could have. Silence settled around the table. Outside, rain continued whispering against the glass. Arthur's small fingers curled around the edge of the tablecloth. "I don't remember Mama very well," he confessed. "Sometimes I forget her voice." The pain in those words nearly broke Seraphina's heart. Lillian looked toward her brothers. "Cedric tries to protect us." Cedric immediately looked uncomfortable. "But he shouldn't have to," Seraphina said softly. The boy's expression flickered with surprise. No one had spoken to him like a child in a very long time. "We thought if father met someone kind first," Lillian continued, "he wouldn't marry Lady Beatrice. And somehow that person became me?" Arthur nodded enthusiastically. "You helped the waitress." Seraphina blinked. "What?" "You picked up the plates she dropped," Arthur explained. "That was nice." For a moment she almost laughed. Their grand plan rested entirely upon a spilled tray. "Children," she said gently, "I cannot pretend to be anyone's future mother." 3 disappointed faces immediately appeared. The sight was devastating. Cedric looked away first. Lillian lowered her head. Then Arthur's eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Not manipulative tears. The helpless tears of a little boy terrified of losing the only family he had left. "Could you stay with us for one day?" he whispered. Serafina felt something twist painfully inside her chest. "One day?" Arthur nodded. "Just so we can know what it's like." No argument prepared itself upon her lips. No practical excuse seemed strong enough. She looked at Cedric's burdened shoulders, Lillian's trembling hands, and Arthur's desperate hope. Logic told her to refuse. Compassion demanded something else. An hour later she found herself seated inside the Everly carriage, traveling toward the vast estate she had heard about only in stories. The children spoke excitedly throughout the journey while Serafina wondered whether she had completely lost her senses. Rain clouds drifted apart as the manor finally appeared beyond iron gates. Everly Manor rose from the countryside like something from a dream, magnificent and imposing against the fading afternoon sky. The children hurried her inside through a side entrance, laughing for the first time all day. Then the sound of carriage wheels echoed across the front courtyard. Every child froze. Cedric's face turned pale. Lillian's eyes widened. Arthur grabbed Serafina's hand. The enormous front doors opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble floor. And before anyone could explain a single thing, Duke Tristan Everly stepped into the entrance hall, lifted his gaze toward the unfamiliar young woman standing beside his children, and stopped dead in his tracks. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire entrance hall. Duke Tristan Everly stood motionless beneath the crystal chandelier, rainwater still glistening on the shoulders of his dark coat. Tall, broad-shouldered, and striking despite the years grief had etched into his features, he possessed the commanding presence of a man accustomed to obedience. His gray eyes moved from Cedric to Lillian, then Arthur, before finally settling upon the unfamiliar young woman standing among them. Serafina immediately lowered her gaze. "I sincerely apologize, Your Grace." Tristan's expression hardened. "Who are you?" Before she could answer, Arthur tightened his grip on her hand. "She isn't in trouble." "Arthur," Tristan said quietly. The boy fell silent. Cedric stepped forward. "Father, this is Miss Serafina Vale." "I gathered that much." The Duke's voice remained calm, which somehow felt more intimidating than anger. "What I wish to know is why a stranger is standing inside my home." Serafina drew a steady breath. "The fault is entirely mine." "No," Cedric interrupted. "It isn't." Tristan turned toward his eldest son. "Explain." What followed was perhaps the most uncomfortable explanation ever delivered inside Everly Manor. Cedric confessed the entire scheme. Lillian admitted they had approached Serafina in the tea room. Arthur openly declared that he had asked her to become their future mother. Each revelation deepened the Duke's astonishment. By the time the story ended, several nearby servants appeared dangerously close to dropping whatever they were carrying. Serafina wished the marble floor would swallow her whole. "I never intended deception, Your Grace," she said. "The children were distressed, and I merely wished to comfort them." Tristan studied her carefully. His expression revealed nothing. "Thank you for your kindness." The words sounded formal rather than warm. "However, I believe it would be best if my carriage returned you to town immediately." Arthur's face crumpled. Lillian looked ready to cry. Cedric clenched his jaw. "No." The single word echoed through the hall. Everyone stared at him. Cedric rarely challenged his father directly. The Duke's eyebrows lifted slightly. "No. No, father." Tristan's gaze sharpened. The boy swallowed. Yet he did not retreat. "She only helped us." "Cedric. You always tell me honorable people should be treated honorably." The Duke said nothing. "She didn't lie to us," Cedric continued. "She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for anything. We brought her here." A strange silence settled between father and son. For the first time, Tristan seemed to notice how desperately his children were looking at him. Not rebellious. Not spoiled. Afraid. That realization softened something invisible within him. Very slightly. At last he exhaled. "Miss Vale." "Yes, Your Grace?" "You may remain for dinner." Relief swept across three young faces instantly. "After dinner," Tristan added, "we shall discuss appropriate arrangements." The children accepted the compromise as though they had won a great battle. Serafina merely hoped to survive the evening. Dinner took place in a magnificent dining room illuminated by dozens of candles. Silver reflected golden light across polished crystal, while portraits of long-dead Everly ancestors watched from the walls. Serafina had never dined in such splendor. Yet it was not the grandeur that held her attention. It was the family. Or rather, the absence of one. The enormous table had clearly been designed for joyful gatherings. Instead, it felt haunted by empty spaces. Conversation arrived in hesitant fragments. Cedric spoke only when necessary. Lillian pushed food around her plate. Arthur occasionally glanced toward the vacant chair where his mother had once sat. The sadness was so familiar, so deeply rooted, that even the servants moved quietly around it. Then something unexpected happened. Arthur accidentally knocked over his glass. The water spilled across the tablecloth. The boy immediately froze. Terror filled his eyes. Serafina understood at once. He expected criticism. Instead she smiled. "Well," she said lightly, reaching for a napkin, "that glass clearly wanted an adventure." Arthur blinked. "What?" It escaped. The little boy stared. Then a giggle slipped free. Lillian laughed next. A moment later Arthur was laughing so hard he nearly forgot the accident entirely. Even Cedric smiled. A genuine smile. The first Tristan had seen from his eldest son in weeks. The Duke found himself watching Serafina. Not because of her beauty, though she possessed that in abundance. He watched because she had accomplished in seconds what countless tutors, governesses, and visitors had failed to achieve. She made his children forget their sadness. The realization unsettled him. Over the following days, the temporary arrangement somehow continued. One day became two. Two became four. Each morning Serafina fully intended to leave. Each evening another reason appeared for her to stay. Arthur developed a habit of following her through the manor like a devoted shadow. Lillian began bringing books to read beside her. Cedric maintained a more cautious distance, yet he increasingly sought her advice. One afternoon she found him alone in the library. "You carry too much responsibility," she told him. His shoulders stiffened. "Someone has to. You are 13. Father has responsibilities. And so do you." The boy looked away. Serafina's voice softened. "Protecting your family does not mean carrying every burden alone." Something vulnerable flickered behind his composure. No one had ever given him permission to simply be a boy. Meanwhile, Lillian slowly emerged from the loneliness that had wrapped itself around her since her mother's death. One evening she arrived carrying a small wooden box. Carefully she removed a pale blue ribbon. "My mother loved this one." Serafina looked at the treasured keepsake. "It's beautiful." Lillian nodded. Then she placed it gently into Serafina's hands. The gesture was so trusting that words failed them both. Across the room Tristan witnessed the exchange. His chest tightened unexpectedly. That ribbon had belonged to his late wife. Lillian had guarded it for years. Yet she offered it willingly. The significance was impossible to ignore. Days passed. The manor changed. Laughter echoed through hallways once silent. Windows seemed brighter. Meals lasted longer. Even the servants smiled more frequently. More than once Tristan overheard whispered remarks that Everleigh Manor finally felt alive again. He dismissed such comments whenever possible. Yet part of him knew they were true. One stormy evening, thunder rolled across the countryside while rain lashed against the windows. The family gathered near the library fireplace. Arthur fought sleep with determined stubbornness. Eventually exhaustion won. His head settled against Serafina's shoulder. Minutes later he was asleep. She adjusted the blanket around him without disturbing his rest. The firelight painted warm gold across her features. Tristan looked up from his book. For a moment the scene before him felt impossibly familiar. A woman. A child. A sense of peace he had not experienced in years. The ache that followed caught him completely unprepared. Not because she reminded him of his wife. Because she didn't. Serafina was entirely herself. And somehow that frightened him more. Later that night, after everyone retired, Tristan wandered through the silent corridors of the manor. His footsteps eventually carried him toward a room he rarely entered. His late wife's study. Dust lingered undisturbed upon shelves lined with books. Moonlight spilled through tall windows. The memories waiting there felt almost tangible. As he stood beside her old desk, something caught his eye. A sealed envelope hidden beneath a stack of forgotten journals. His name appeared upon the front in familiar handwriting. His breath stopped. Slowly he picked it up. The paper had yellowed with age. The seal remained unbroken. 5 years after her death, his wife's final letter had somehow been waiting for him all along. And as thunder echoed beyond the windows, Tristan stared at the message addressed in her hand, suddenly unable to shake the feeling that whatever waited inside might change everything. The study remained silent except for the distant rumble of thunder beyond the windows. Duke Tristan Everleigh stood motionless beside his late wife's desk, the sealed envelope resting in his hands. Moonlight pooled across the worn wood, illuminating dust that had remained undisturbed for years. Countless times he had entered the room intending to sort through her belongings. Countless times he had failed. Now, 5 years after her death, fate had placed her voice before him once more. His fingers hesitated upon the seal. For a moment he feared opening it. Not because he doubted what she had written. Because he feared remembering how much he still missed her. Slowly he broke the seal. The paper unfolded with a faint whisper. Her handwriting appeared immediately. Elegant. Familiar. Painfully alive. Tristan sat down and began to read. My dearest Tristan, if you are reading this letter, then I am no longer beside you. The words struck him with unexpected force. He continued. I know you better than anyone. You will pretend strength long after your heart has broken. You will devote yourself to duty. You will place the children before yourself. And you will convince everyone that loneliness does not matter. His throat tightened. The letter felt less like a memory and more like a conversation. As though she stood beside him once again. Then he reached the final paragraph. If our children ever choose a woman themselves, trust them. Children see goodness before society does. They recognize kindness before titles. They understand love before adults complicate it. If they open their hearts to someone, look carefully before turning away. Tristan lowered the page. The room suddenly felt smaller. His wife could never have known about Serafina. Yet the words seemed written specifically for this moment. Specifically for her. For several minutes he simply stared into the darkness. The children had chosen Serafina. Not because of wealth. Not because of status. Because she had been kind. And somehow that simple truth disturbed every certainty he possessed. The following morning, Tristan found himself watching Serafina differently. Not intentionally. Not even consciously. Yet his attention returned to her repeatedly. He noticed the way she always listened before speaking. The way she treated servants with the same respect she offered nobility. The way she never attempted to impress anyone. Most of all, he noticed how naturally she fit into the spaces his family had left empty. That afternoon he discovered her in the gardens with Arthur. The little boy sat beside a flower bed, his small face clouded with frustration. What happened? Tristan asked. Arthur sighed dramatically. I planted them wrong. Several tiny seedlings leaned awkwardly from the soil. Serafina smiled. Not wrong. Arthur frowned. They look crooked. So do many beautiful things. The boy considered that. Really? Really? She gently adjusted one stem. Sometimes growing takes time. Arthur's expression brightened. Moments later he returned to his gardening with renewed determination. Tristan remained where he stood. The conversation had been simple. Yet Arthur looked happier than he had in months. That evening another change revealed itself. Lillian appeared unusually quiet during supper. Normally Serafina could coax smiles from her without effort. Tonight the little girl barely touched her meal. After dinner, Serafina found her alone beside a window overlooking the grounds. The setting sun painted gold across the glass. Would you like to tell me what's troubling you? Lillian stared outside. Today was Mother's birthday. The words barely rose above a whisper. Serafina's heart ached. No wonder the child had withdrawn. What do you miss most? Lillian thought carefully. Everything. The honesty of the answer nearly shattered the silence between them. Tears gathered in the little girl's eyes. I don't want to forget her. You won't. But I already forget things. Serafina knelt beside her. Loving someone doesn't mean remembering every detail. Lillian looked uncertain. It doesn't? No. Serafina gently squeezed her hand. It means carrying them in your heart. And hearts remember far more than minds do. The child finally allowed herself to cry. Not the restrained tears of someone trying to appear brave. The tears of a little girl who missed her mother. Serafina simply held her until the storm passed. From the doorway Tristan watched the entire exchange. Something shifted inside him. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But undeniably. 4 years he had been attempting to shield his children from grief. Serafina somehow taught them how to survive it instead. Days later, Cedric became the next heart she reached. The eldest Everly rarely revealed weakness. He carried responsibility like armor. One evening Serafina found him alone in the library, staring at a portrait of his mother. You look troubled. Cedric immediately straightened. I'm fine. No. The boy glanced away. I'm supposed to help father. You already do. Not enough. The confession emerged before he could stop it. If I were stronger, maybe things would be easier. Serafina studied him quietly. You were 8 years old when your mother died. Cedric froze. You were a child. I know. Do you? The question landed gently but firmly. Silence followed. Then the boy's carefully maintained composure cracked. Just slightly. I should have protected Lillian and Arthur better. The guilt had clearly lived inside him for years. Serafina's voice softened. Some burdens were never yours to carry. For the first time, Cedric allowed himself to believe her. The change was subtle. Yet Tristan noticed it immediately. The tension permanently lodged in his son's shoulders began to ease. The anger he carried started to fade. Even his smiles appeared more genuine. Meanwhile, Tristan found his own defenses weakening. Walks through the gardens became longer. Conversations beside fireplaces lasted later into the night. Silences between them grew comfortable rather than awkward. He learned about Serafina's childhood, her schoolteacher father, her love of books, her dreams that had never quite found room to grow. And every discovery deepened the danger. Because admiration was becoming something else. Something he had not permitted himself to feel in years. Unfortunately, he was not the only one noticing. Several miles away, Lady Beatrice Montrose sat inside her elegant drawing room listening to increasingly troubling reports. The Duke's visits had become less frequent. His letters shorter. His attention more distant. A woman was responsible. A woman with no title. No fortune. No family influence. The insult alone infuriated her. By the following week she had hired investigators. She wanted answers. She wanted weaknesses. She wanted something she could use. The reports arrived sooner than expected. Serafina Vale's background proved painfully ordinary. The daughter of a village schoolteacher. No aristocratic blood. No estate. No inheritance. Nothing remotely suitable for a future duchess. Beatrice smiled for the first time in days. Now she possessed a weapon. And she intended to use it. A week later, beneath glittering chandeliers and the gaze of hundreds of nobles gathered for the season's grandest royal ball, Serafina stood beside Tristan in a sea of silk, jewels, and aristocratic privilege. The orchestra played. Guests mingled. Everything appeared perfect. Until Lady Beatrice stepped into the center of the ballroom, raised her voice just enough to command attention, and announced the humble truth about Miss Serafina Vale for every noble ear in the kingdom to hear. The music stopped. And suddenly every face in the ballroom turned toward Serafina. The silence that followed Lady Beatrice's announcement felt far louder than the orchestra that had filled the ballroom moments earlier. Hundreds of eyes settled upon Serafina. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting golden light across polished marble floors and jeweled gowns, yet she suddenly felt exposed beneath that brilliance. The magnificent hall that had seemed beautiful only moments before now resembled a courtroom. Whispers began immediately. Some were barely audible. Others were deliberately loud. The daughter of a schoolteacher? How extraordinary. She has no title at all. Imagine believing she belongs here. The words struck like small stones. Not powerful enough individually to wound deeply. Together they became impossible to ignore. Serafina stood perfectly still. Years of modest living had taught her dignity. Yet dignity could not entirely shield a human heart. Across the ballroom, Lady Beatrice watched with quiet satisfaction. She had achieved exactly what she wanted. Not merely humiliation. Separation. She wanted Tristan to see the difference between affection and suitability, between kindness and status, between a pleasant guest and a future duchess. Unfortunately for her, Duke Tristan Everly had reached a very different conclusion. He crossed the ballroom without hesitation. The crowd parted automatically. Authority surrounded him as naturally as breath. When he reached Serafina's side, he positioned himself beside her rather than apart from her. The gesture alone silenced many whispers. Enough. His voice was calm. It did not need to be loud. The room obeyed immediately. No one challenged a duke. Especially not Tristan Everly. He turned toward Lady Beatrice. You have embarrassed a guest in my presence. I merely stated facts. You used facts as weapons. A faint flush appeared upon Beatrice's face. Several nobles suddenly found the floor fascinating. Tristan's gaze swept across the room. Miss Vale has shown more kindness, grace, and character than many people who inherited their titles. The statement landed heavily. A few guests looked distinctly uncomfortable. Serafina felt her chest tighten. He was defending her. Publicly. Openly. Without hesitation. The realization should have comforted her. Instead it frightened her. Because every word he spoke increased the cost. Every defense deepened the divide between him and society. The remainder of the evening passed beneath a cloud of tension. Though conversation resumed, the atmosphere never recovered. Every glance reminded Serafina that she did not belong. Every smile felt forced. Every whisper carried hidden judgment. By the time the carriage returned to Everly Manor, exhaustion weighed heavily upon her heart. The children greeted her immediately upon arrival. Arthur threw his arms around her waist. Lillian asked whether the ball had been beautiful. Cedric studied her face carefully. You look sad. The honesty of the observation nearly broke her composure. I am merely tired. Cedric did not appear convinced. Neither was she. That night sleep refused to come. Moonlight spilled across her bedroom floor while memories replayed endlessly. The laughter. The whispers. The pity. Most painful of all, Tristan's defense. Not because she disliked it, because she cherished it far too much. Somewhere along the way, the temporary guest had become something dangerous. She had begun imagining a future. A place within this family. A life she had never expected to want. Now reality stood before her with brutal clarity. Love could not erase society. Affection could not erase rank. And if she stayed, Tristan would eventually pay the price. Near dawn, her decision was made. The house remained silent as she packed her small collection of belongings. She owned little. A few dresses. Several books. The ribbon Lillian had given her. Each item carried memories she wished she could take without pain. Then came the letters. The most difficult part. She wrote one to Arthur first. Simple words a 5-year-old could understand. A reminder that bravery was not the absence of fear. A promise that she would always cherish him. The tears arrived before she finished. Lillian's letter took longer. She thanked her for trust, friendship, and courage. She reminded her that love never vanished simply because someone was gone. For Cedric, she wrote something different. She told him he was allowed to be young. Allowed to rest. Allowed to stop carrying burdens that belonged to adults. Finally, she reached Tristan's letter. The blank page remained untouched for several minutes. Too many emotions crowded together. Respect. Admiration. Gratitude. Love. Eventually she began writing. When the final sentence was complete, her hands trembled. She folded the page carefully. Then she left. The first rays of sunrise painted pale gold across the countryside as the carriage carried her away from Everleigh Manor. She never looked back. If she did, she feared she would return. The discovery occurred hours later. Arthur found her room empty. At first he assumed she was downstairs. Then he checked the gardens. Then the library. Then every room he could reach. Panic arrived slowly. Then all at once. She isn't here. The words echoed through the manor. Lillian dropped the book she was holding. Cedric's face immediately darkened. Servants began searching. The house filled with anxious movement. Within an hour the truth became unavoidable. Serafina was gone. Arthur cried until exhaustion stole his voice. Lillian locked herself inside her bedroom. Food trays returned untouched. The brightness that had gradually returned to the manor vanished completely. Even the servants seemed affected. The estate felt colder. Emptier. As though warmth itself had departed. Cedric handled the loss differently. His grief transformed into anger. When Tristan finally entered the study that evening, he found his eldest son waiting. "You let her leave." The accusation arrived without warning. Tristan stared at him. "She made her own choice." "No." Cedric's eyes burned with frustration. "She left because people hurt her." The words struck harder than intended. Because they were true. The boy turned away. "You always notice everything." Tristan said nothing. "Except what matters." Moments later Cedric left the room. The silence he left behind felt unbearable. Alone, Tristan unfolded Serafina's farewell letter. He read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Each reading revealed something new. Not blame. Not bitterness. Only sacrifice. She had left because she believed it would protect him. Protect the children. Protect the family she loved. The realization settled heavily upon him. For years he had convinced himself that losing his wife had been the deepest pain he would ever endure. Now another truth emerged. The thought of never seeing Serafina again terrified him. Not as a friend. Not as a guest. As the woman who had quietly become the center of his family's happiness. And perhaps the center of his own. That night no laughter echoed through Everleigh Manor. No footsteps raced through hallways. No voices filled the rooms. The silence returned exactly as it had existed before Serafina arrived. Only now everyone understood what was missing. Before dawn broke the following morning, 3 small figures slipped quietly through a side entrance carrying bags, blankets, and enough determination to challenge the world itself. By the time the household awoke, Cedric, Lillian, and Arthur were already gone, searching for the woman they refused to lose forever. Duke Tristan Everleigh had faced political scandals, financial crises, and the grief of burying the woman he had once believed he would love forever. Yet nothing compared to the terror that gripped him when he learned his 3 children had vanished before sunrise. The discovery transformed Everleigh Manor into chaos. Servants searched every room. Stable hands rode in every direction. Messengers were dispatched to nearby villages. Within minutes, Tristan understood exactly where they had gone. They were searching for Serafina. The realization carried equal measures of fear and shame. His children had done what he should have done days earlier. They had chosen not to let her walk away. For the first time in years, Tristan abandoned dignity, protocol, and pride. He mounted his horse personally and rode out beneath a gray morning sky. The countryside stretched endlessly before him. Every mile seemed longer than the last. As he searched, memories followed him relentlessly. Arthur asleep in Seraphina's arms. Lillian smiling again after months of sadness. Cedric laughing despite himself. The warmth she had brought into rooms that had once felt frozen. The life she had restored to a family that had forgotten how to heal. He had spent years protecting his heart from loss. Without realizing it, Seraphina had walked past every defense. And now she was gone. By midday, reports began arriving from nearby towns. 3 children matching the Everly siblings' descriptions had been seen traveling together. The trail led toward Willowbrook. Toward the very tea room where everything had begun. Tristan urged his horse faster. Meanwhile, inside the quiet tea room, Seraphina sat at the same table beside the rain-speckled window where 3 children had once changed her life forever. A cup of untouched tea rested before her. The familiar surroundings offered comfort, yet her heart remained unsettled. She missed them. Not occasionally. Not in passing. Constantly. Every empty moment reminded her of Arthur's laughter. Every silence reminded her of Lillian's gentle voice. Every thoughtful glance reminded her of Cedric. And every heartbeat seemed determined to remind her of Tristan. She had left to protect them. Yet the separation felt far more painful than the scandal she had fled. The bell above the door suddenly chimed. Seraphina looked up. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Arthur stood in the doorway. Behind him stood Lillian. And beside them stood Cedric. All 3 appeared exhausted from travel. Arthur immediately ran toward her. Seraphina. She barely had time to stand before he threw himself into her arms. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Arthur. The little boy clung to her desperately. You left. The simple accusation carried enough heartbreak to shatter her. Lillian reached them next. She wrapped her arms around Seraphina's waist. We thought we lost you. Cedric arrived last. His composure lasted only a few seconds. Then he looked away to hide suspiciously bright eyes. You shouldn't have gone. Seraphina's heart broke all over again. What are you doing here? We came for you, Arthur said immediately. We're taking you home. A tear escaped before she could stop it. You shouldn't have traveled alone. We had to, Lillian whispered. Because Father wasn't fixing it. That statement earned a reluctant nod from Cedric. For a few precious moments, the 4 remained together. The world outside seemed to disappear. The tea room faded. The worries faded. Only love remained. Then the bell above the door rang again. This time every child turned toward the entrance. Duke Tristan Everly stood there. Breathing hard. Coat dusted with road dirt. Eyes fixed entirely upon Seraphina. The room fell silent. Neither moved immediately. Weeks of unspoken feelings seemed to gather between them. Then Tristan crossed the room. Not as a duke. Not as a powerful nobleman. Simply as a man who had finally stopped running from the truth. The children stepped aside. Seraphina's pulse thundered. You found them, she said softly. No. His voice was rough. They found you. For a moment neither knew what to say. Then Tristan reached into his coat pocket. He withdrew a folded document. The engagement contract. Recognition flashed across her face. He placed it on the table. I ended it. The word stunned everyone nearby. Arthur gasped. Lillian smiled through tears. Cedric looked immensely satisfied. Tristan never looked away from Seraphina. Lady Beatrice is no longer part of our future. Tristan. No. His voice softened. For once, allow me to speak first. She fell silent. The entire tea room seemed to do the same. Even strangers sensed they were witnessing something important. Tristan drew a slow breath. When my wife died, I convinced myself my life had become simple. Pain flickered briefly across his features. My duty was to raise my children. Nothing more. He glanced toward Cedric, Lillian, and Arthur. I thought surviving was enough. The children listened quietly. Then 3 stubborn children invited a stranger into my home. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Arthur looked particularly proud. Tristan smiled faintly. And everything changed. His gaze returned to Seraphina. You brought laughter back to halls that had forgotten joy. His voice grew steadier. You taught my son he did not have to carry the world on his shoulders. Cedric lowered his eyes. You helped my daughter believe happiness was not disloyal to grief. Lillian wiped away tears. You became the mother my youngest barely remembered having. Arthur hugged Seraphina tighter. Then Tristan stepped closer. And somewhere along the way you became something else. The room seemed to hold its breath. You became the woman I cannot imagine losing. Seraphina's eyes filled. The confession carried no rehearsed elegance. Only truth. And that made it infinitely more powerful. Tristan slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps echoed throughout the tea room. Several patrons openly stared. The Duke ignored every one of them. His attention never left Serafina. You came into my life because 3 children chose you. His voice trembled slightly. The vulnerability surprised even him. I stand before you because my heart chose you too. A tear slid down Serafina's cheek. For the first time since leaving Everly Manor, she allowed herself to hope. Not cautiously. Not fearfully. Completely. Tristan reached for her hand. Come home. The simple words carried everything he could not fit into a speech. Love, trust, family, the future. Serafina looked at the 3 children surrounding her. Arthur's hopeful smile. Lillian's shining eyes. Cedric's quiet faith. Then she looked at the man kneeling before her. The man who had finally chosen love over fear. Yes. The answer emerged as little more than a whisper. It was enough. The tea room erupted into applause. Arthur cheered loudly. Lillian cried openly. Cedric laughed with visible relief. Tristan rose and gathered Serafina into his arms. For the first time, neither felt the need to hide what existed between them. Months later, sunlight poured through the stained-glass windows of a magnificent cathedral as Serafina walked down the aisle in ivory silk. The kingdom watched its beloved duke marry the woman who had transformed his family. Cedric stood proudly beside his father. Lillian carried flowers. Arthur smiled so much his cheeks hurt. When the vows were spoken, no one doubted their sincerity. This was not a marriage built upon convenience or politics. It was built upon choice. Years later, on another rainy afternoon, 5 familiar figures sat together inside the Willowbrook tea room. The same corner. The same window. The same table where everything had begun. Laughter filled the air. Arthur, older now but no less mischievous, grinned across the table. Do you remember what we asked you the first day? Serafina laughed. I could never forget. Lillian smiled. You looked terrified. I was terrified. Cedric shook his head. It was still our best idea. Tristan reached for her hand beneath the table. She squeezed it gently. Outside, rain danced against the glass exactly as it had years before. Inside, warmth surrounded them. Family surrounded them. Love surrounded them. And as Serafina looked around the table at the husband who adored her and the 3 children who had first opened their hearts to her, she realized something extraordinary. The question that had changed her life no longer required an answer. She was no longer pretending to be their future mother. She had become the mother they chose. And the Duchess they loved.